The giraffe herd had to move, and they had to move now because the predators were closing in from multiple directions, and staying in this exposed location any longer would put the entire group at catastrophic risk that no rational herd leader could justify taking. The matriarch, a 15-year-old female who had led this particular herd through countless migrations and dangerous situations over her lifetime, had already made the calculation that survival required movement even though one member of the herd could not move with them. A young calf, probably 8 months old based on his size and the still visible spots that would fade as he matured into adulthood, had broken his front left leg in a fall during the previous night when the herd had been forced to run from a lion pride that had attempted an ambush near their watering hole. The break was severe, with bone visibly protruding through skin in a compound fracture that would never heal properly even with veterinary intervention, and the calf's ability to walk had been reduced to agonizing dragging movements that could not possibly keep pace with the herd's necessary travel speed. The calf's mother, a 7-year-old female who was in her prime reproductive years and who had successfully raised 2 previous calves to independence, stood beside her injured offspring for 10 full minutes that felt like hours as the rest of the herd began moving away in response to the matriarch's urgent vocalizations and body language that communicated immediate departure was required. She faced the kind of choice that no mother of any species should have to make, but that nature forces upon animals in situations where resources are limited and threats are overwhelming. She could stay with her injured calf, providing comfort and protection for the hours or perhaps days it would take for predators to inevitably find him and kill him, but staying meant abandoning the rest of the herd and losing the safety that numbers provided, and almost certainly dying herself when the predators came, because a single adult giraffe could not effectively defend against a coordinated predator attack. Or she could leave with the herd, preserving her own life and maintaining her ability to produce future calves who might have better chances of survival, accepting the terrible truth that this particular offspring was already lost even though he was still breathing, and looking at her with eyes that held confusion about why she was not helping him the way mothers always help their young when danger threatened. She had 3 other surviving calves from previous years who were traveling with the herd, healthy young giraffes who had good prospects for reaching adulthood and contributing to the next generation if they could continue receiving the benefits of herd protection and maternal guidance. Losing one calf was a tragedy that would haunt her in whatever way giraffes processed grief and loss, but losing all 4 calves plus her own life by staying with an offspring who was already effectively dead made no sense from any survival perspective that governed herd animal behavior. The mathematics of survival were brutal and clear. Sacrifice 1 to preserve 3, accept the loss that could not be prevented in order to protect the futures that could still be secured through good decision-making and rational assessment of impossible situations. The mother giraffe turned one final time to look at her injured calf, who would later be named Rafiki by the rangers who would eventually become involved in this story, though in this moment he was simply a terrified young animal who could not understand why his mother was leaving when he needed her most desperately. Their eyes met across the 5 meters that separated them, and in that moment something passed between them that was beyond words or concepts or any human framework for understanding animal communication. The calf's eyes held pain from his shattered leg and confusion about why the herd was leaving, and a desperate pleading for his mother to stay and fix this problem the way mothers fixed all problems through their presence and protection and the resources they provided. The mother's eyes held anguish and guilt and the kind of grief that comes from making choices that violate every maternal instinct but that survival logic demands must be made anyway, the terrible knowledge that she was abandoning her offspring to certain death and that this choice would stay with her for whatever remained of her life, even though it was the only choice that made sense given the circumstances. She turned away for the final time and began walking rapidly to catch up with the herd that was already disappearing over a rise in the terrain about half a kilometer distant, her long legs carrying her away from her dying calf with mechanical efficiency, even as her body language communicated distress that was visible to any observer who understood giraffe behavior and emotional expression. Rafiki tried to take one stumbling step after his departing mother, his broken leg buckling immediately under any weight and sending him crashing to the ground with a cry of pain that carried clearly across the open savanna and attracted the attention of every predator within a 2-kilometer radius who was listening for exactly such sounds of vulnerability and distress. He lay there in the grass where he had fallen, too injured to rise again without assistance, watching the herd disappear into the distance and taking with them all hope of survival through group protection or maternal care. The hyena clan had been tracking this giraffe herd for 3 days, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, and they picked up Rafiki's scent and his distress calls within minutes of his mother's departure. Hyenas were among the most efficient and relentless predators in Africa, capable of taking down prey much larger than themselves through coordinated pack tactics and sheer persistence and a willingness to inflict suffering over extended periods if that was what successful hunting required. A young injured giraffe alone on open ground with no herd protection was the kind of easy meal that hyena clans dreamed about, requiring minimal effort or risk and providing substantial calories that would feed many pack members and strengthen the clan's position within the competitive predator hierarchy of the region. The clan numbered approximately 15 individuals, including several large females who served as pack leaders and multiple young males who were eager to prove themselves through successful hunts. And they began moving toward Rafiki's location with the kind of purposeful coordination that characterized experienced predators who had identified vulnerable prey and were executing well-practiced strategies for securing kills. Approximately 100 meters from where Rafiki lay injured and alone, a lioness named Amara was resting in the shade of a small cluster of acacia trees after a long night of hunting that had been only partially successful and had left her tired but still hungry enough that she would need to hunt again soon to meet her caloric needs. Amara was a 7-year-old female who had been born into a large and successful pride but who had lost her social connections and pride membership 2 years earlier when the dominant males who had controlled her birth pride were killed by younger rivals who then systematically eliminated all the cubs sired by the previous males, as was typical in lion social dynamics and takeover situations. She had survived that purge only because she was old enough to be considered an adult rather than a cub, but the new males had driven out all the females from the previous regime to make room for females from their own bloodlines who would be more reliably loyal to the new power structure. Amara had spent the past 2 years as a solitary or semi-solitary female, occasionally cooperating with other displaced lionesses for hunts but never fully integrating into a new pride structure because the prides in this region were already at capacity and had no interest in accepting outsiders who would compete for resources and males and territory. She had learned to survive alone in ways that most lionesses never developed because they lived their entire lives within the support structures of stable prides, becoming a more skilled hunter than average because she had no choice but to succeed at bringing down prey without the cooperative strategies that made pride hunting so effective. She had also become more observant and thoughtful about the behavior of other animals because her survival depended on understanding the complex social dynamics and movement patterns of both prey and competing predators in ways that pride lions could often ignore because they had numerical superiority to fall back on when situations became challenging. From her resting position in the acacia shade, Amara had watched the entire drama of the giraffe herd's departure and the mother's agonizing choice to abandon her injured calf. And something about that scene had affected her in ways that went beyond simple predatory interest in vulnerable prey. She had seen the moment when the mother giraffe looked back at her dying offspring, had witnessed the body language and emotional communication that passed between mother and calf in those final seconds before the mother turned away forever, had recognized in that exchange something that resonated with her own experiences of loss and abandonment and the brutal choices that survival sometimes demanded from creatures who would prefer to make different decisions if circumstances allowed for the luxury of choosing compassion over logic. Amara herself had been abandoned in a sense when her pride was taken over and she was driven out to face solitary existence. And while the mechanisms and circumstances were different from what the baby giraffe was experiencing, there was a fundamental similarity in the experience of having your support structure and security suddenly ripped away through no fault of your own and being left alone to face threats that were designed to be faced by groups rather than individuals. She had felt the terror and confusion and desperate loneliness of those early days after her exile, had struggled to learn skills that should have been supported by pride cooperation but that she was forced to develop alone through dangerous trial and error, had experienced the constant stress of knowing that any injury or illness or simple bad luck could result in death because there was no safety net or backup support when you were living without a social group in an ecosystem where social structures were fundamental to survival. She watched Rafiki lying injured in the grass approximately 100 meters from her position, watched the hyena clan beginning to converge on his location from multiple directions with the coordinated movement patterns that indicated they had identified prey and were moving into position for a kill, and she felt something stirring inside her chest that was not hunger or predatory interest but something more complex that drew on her own memories and emotional experiences in ways that Amara herself could not have articulated or fully understood. She should have stayed in the shade and conserved her energy for her own survival needs, or perhaps she should have joined the hunt herself and claimed a share of the easy meal that the hyenas were about to secure. But instead, she found herself rising to her feet and beginning to move toward Rafiki's position, driven by impulses that made no logical sense from a survival standpoint but that felt necessary and urgent in ways that overrode her rational assessment of costs and benefits. If you believe that witnessing another creature's abandonment can awaken empathy powerful enough to override predatory instincts and self-interest, that the experience of being cast out and left alone can create a kind of understanding that transcends species boundaries and transforms enemies into protectors, then please subscribe to Lion King Stories. Every subscription helps us share more incredible true tales from the African wilderness that challenge our assumptions about animal behavior and prove that empathy and compassion are not uniquely human traits but universal responses to suffering that can emerge in the most unexpected circumstances and from the most unlikely sources. These stories matter because they remind us that the natural world is far more complex and emotionally rich than reductionist frameworks acknowledge, that individual animals make choices based on factors that science is only beginning to understand, and that the capacity for kindness exists even in creatures we have been taught to see as purely instinct-driven killers. Your support allows us to continue documenting these transformative moments that expand human understanding and create space for wonder in a world that desperately needs more examples of compassion crossing boundaries we thought were absolute and unchangeable. Amara reached Rafiki's position approximately 30 seconds before the first hyena would have arrived to begin the kill, her massive body moving with the silent speed that made lions such effective hunters despite their considerable size. She positioned herself between the injured giraffe calf and the approaching hyenas, her body language broadcasting protective intent and territorial claim in ways that the hyenas immediately recognized and responded to with frustrated vocalizations and circling behavior as they tried to assess whether this challenge was serious or whether the lioness could be driven off through persistence and numerical superiority. A single lioness was not normally a major threat to a hyena clan of 15 members, and if the hyenas had been willing to accept some injuries and casualties, they could have almost certainly overwhelmed Amara through coordinated attacks from multiple directions and superior numbers that would eventually exhaust even a powerful predator fighting alone. But hyenas were practical and risk-averse when it came to situations where food was not desperately scarce, and fighting a full-grown lioness over a single giraffe calf when other prey was available in the territory seemed like poor cost-benefit analysis given the injuries that some clan members would inevitably sustain in the conflict. They circled and vocalized and made feinting movements to test Amara's resolve and see if she would abandon her position when faced with numerical odds that should have been intimidating, but Amara held her ground with the kind of stubborn determination that suggested she was committed to protecting the injured calf regardless of what threats materialized or how irrational that commitment appeared from a survival logic perspective. The standoff lasted for approximately 20 minutes of tense confrontation during which Rafiki lay motionless in the grass behind Amara's protective bulk, probably too shocked and confused to fully process what was happening or understand that the enormous predator standing over him represented protection rather than an additional threat to his already desperate situation. The hyenas eventually withdrew to a distance of about 50 meters and settled into a patient watching pattern that communicated they were not giving up on this meal but were willing to wait for Amara to lower her guard or leave the area or show some weakness that would create an opportunity for them to move in and claim the prey they had already invested time and energy in stalking. As the immediate crisis of the hyena attack subsided into the tense equilibrium of a waiting game, Amara looked down at the injured giraffe calf she had just defended and seemed to recognize for the first time the full magnitude of what she had committed herself to through her impulsive protective action. Rafiki was badly injured with a compound fracture that was clearly visible even to non-veterinary observation, was severely stressed from the trauma of abandonment and injury, and was completely helpless in terms of being able to defend himself or move to safety or contribute anything to his own survival beyond simply continuing to breathe and hope that the terrifying predator standing over him continued to act as protector rather than reverting to her natural role as hunter. He needed protection not just for the next few hours but potentially for days if he was going to have any chance of surviving until rangers or other humans might discover him and provide the veterinary intervention that could possibly save his life. Though even with human help his survival prospects were marginal at best given the severity of his injuries. Amara had no logical reason to continue this protection, no benefit she would receive from investing time and energy in keeping alive an animal that was not her species and that represented a future meal she was denying herself by preventing the hyenas from making their kill. She should have walked away at this point, letting the hyenas claim their prey while she returned to the shade and rested before beginning her next hunt, cutting her losses on a situation that made no sense and offered no rewards for continued involvement. But she did not walk away. Instead, she settled into a resting position next to Rafiki's injured body, her massive form creating a physical barrier between him and the watching hyenas, her ears constantly moving to track sounds from all directions, her eyes scanning continuously for threats approaching from the tall grass that surrounded them on the open savanna that provided excellent visibility but also excellent approach vectors for predators who might see an injured giraffe calf as too valuable an opportunity to pass up even if claiming that meal meant confronting a protective lioness. The first night was the longest that Amara had experienced in her 7 years of life, longer even than the terrible nights after her exile from her pride, when she had been alone and frightened and uncertain whether she would survive until dawn without the protection and support structure that pride membership provided. The hyenas did not give up or wander off to find easier prey, as Amara had perhaps hoped they might once they realized she was seriously committed to defending the injured calf. Instead, they maintained their patient vigil at a distance that was close enough to observe any change in the situation but far enough to avoid immediate confrontation, waiting for the inevitable moment when Amara would have to leave to drink water or hunt food, or simply rest enough that her vigilance would slip and create an opening for a coordinated rush that would overwhelm her ability to defend all approach vectors simultaneously. The hyena clan was led by a dominant female named Duma, a battle-scarred matriarch who had controlled this territory for 6 years through intelligence and ruthless efficiency that had made her clan one of the most successful predator groups in the region. Duma had seen countless standoffs with lions over kills and territory, and she knew from experience that even the most determined lion would eventually have to abandon a position when hunger or thirst or exhaustion became overwhelming enough to override protective instincts. Her strategy was simple and proven effective through years of application. Maintain constant pressure, never allow the opponent to truly rest or relax, probe continuously for weaknesses in defense, and wait patiently for the inevitable moment when biological needs would force the lion to make a choice between maintaining the vigil and attending to survival requirements that could not be indefinitely ignored. Duma positioned her clan members in a loose circle around Amara and Rafiki, spacing them at intervals that provided overlapping coverage of all potential escape routes while maintaining enough distance that Amara could not attack multiple hyenas simultaneously if she chose to charge their position. This formation was a classic hyena siege tactic that had evolved over countless similar situations, designed to create psychological pressure on the defender through the constant visible presence of threats from all directions while minimizing the risk to individual clan members who might be targeted if they approached too closely. The hyenas settled into their positions with the kind of patient stillness that suggested they were prepared to maintain this standoff for days if necessary, occasionally shifting positions or vocalizing to keep Amara aware of their continued presence, but not expending energy on aggressive displays or charges that would be costly and unnecessary when time and biology were working in their favor. As darkness deepened and the African night settled over the savanna with its chorus of insect sounds and distant predator calls, Rafiki's condition began to deteriorate in ways that added urgency to Amara's protective mission and complicated her already difficult situation. The young giraffe was going into shock from the trauma of his injury and abandonment, his breathing becoming irregular and labored, his body temperature dropping as his physiological system struggled to maintain homeostasis under conditions of extreme stress and pain. He made soft, distressed sounds that were different from his earlier crying, weaker and more intermittent, suggesting that his body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions to conserve energy for basic survival processes. His eyes, when Amara glanced down at him during brief moments when she could spare attention from watching the surrounding hyenas, had the glazed quality that comes from animals who are slipping toward unconsciousness or death, and his limbs twitched occasionally with involuntary movements that indicated his nervous system was being affected by whatever physiological cascade was occurring inside his traumatized body. Amara found herself not just defending Rafiki from external threats but also trying to provide whatever comfort and stabilization she could offer given her limited understanding of giraffe physiology and medical needs. She positioned her body even more closely against his to share body heat and prevent the hypothermia that could kill him as quickly as any predator attack. And she licked his face and neck with her rough tongue and grooming behaviors that were instinctive responses to caring for young animals but that also served the practical purpose of stimulating blood flow and possibly helping to keep him conscious and engaged rather than slipping away into shock and death. The act of caring for Rafiki seemed to deepen Amara's commitment to his protection in ways that went beyond rational calculation, creating emotional investment that made abandoning him increasingly unthinkable even as the costs of protection continued to mount with each passing hour. Throughout that endless first night, the hyenas made 7 distinct serious attempts to approach Rafiki under cover of darkness when visual tracking was more difficult and when they hoped Amara's attention might be divided or her responses might be slowed by exhaustion. Each time, Amara detected the approach through sound or scent or simply through the hypervigilance that comes from knowing you are surrounded by threats and cannot afford even a moment of relaxed attention. She would rise from her resting position with explosive speed and charge toward the approaching hyenas with roars and aggressive body language that communicated she was willing to fight to the death if necessary to maintain her protective position, driving them back to their watching distance and then returning to her position next to Rafiki before the clan could exploit her temporary absence to approach from a different direction. The first attack came around midnight when 3 young male hyenas attempted a coordinated rush from the eastern perimeter where darkness was deepest and where they thought Amara's attention might be focused on the larger group of clan members visible to the west. They approached in near-perfect silence, using techniques learned from years of scavenging and hunting that emphasized stealth and patience, closing to within 15 meters before Amara's ears detected the almost imperceptible sound of grass being compressed under their paws. She spun toward them with a speed that seemed impossible for an animal of her size, covering the distance between her protective position and the attackers in 3 explosive bounds, and the lead hyena barely escaped with his life as Amara's claws raked across his hindquarters and sent him tumbling with a yelp of pain and surprise. The other 2 attackers scattered immediately, abandoning their coordinated strategy in favor of simple escape, and Amara pursued them for approximately 30 meters before stopping and returning quickly to Rafiki, who had been left momentarily unprotected during the chase. The second attack followed barely an hour later, this time from the northern approach where the terrain provided slightly better cover from scattered thorn bushes that could conceal a stalking predator until they were much closer than open ground would allow. 2 experienced female hyenas executed this attempt with the kind of professional patience that came from decades of successful hunting, moving so slowly and carefully that they managed to close to within 10 meters before Amara detected their presence through scent carried on the night breeze. The confrontation that followed was brief but violent, with Amara charging directly toward the closest female and engaging in a brief savage exchange of bites and claw swipes that left both animals bleeding from minor wounds before the hyenas retreated and Amara returned once again to her position beside Rafiki, her sides heaving from exertion and adrenaline and the accumulated stress of constant vigilance without rest. The 3rd through 7th attacks followed similar patterns throughout the night, each attempt using different approaches and tactics as the hyena clan probed for weaknesses in Amara's defense and tested whether exhaustion or injury or simple distraction might create an opening they could exploit. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, Amara had engaged in 7 separate violent confrontations, had covered over a kilometer of total distance in her charges and pursuits of approaching hyenas, and had sustained multiple minor injuries including a deep bite on her left foreleg from a hyena who had gotten closer than the others and had managed to land a solid attack before being driven off. She was bleeding from several wounds, her energy reserves were seriously depleted from the night's exertions, and she had not eaten in over 30 hours since her last partially successful hunt. But she maintained her protective position next to Rafiki with the kind of stubborn determination that suggested she would continue this vigil regardless of personal cost until either the threat was eliminated or she physically could not continue. By the time dawn broke over the savanna on the morning after Rafiki's abandonment by his herd, Amara had not slept at all despite her exhaustion from the previous day's hunting efforts, had not eaten despite her ongoing hunger that was now becoming serious enough to impact her energy levels and response speed, and had not left Rafiki's side even to drink water from the small waterhole located approximately 300 meters from their position. The hyenas were still there, still watching with the patient persistence that made them such successful scavengers and opportunistic hunters, and Amara understood with grim certainty that this standoff would continue for as long as Rafiki remained alive and helpless and unable to defend himself or escape on his own power. The second day brought new challenges as the sun rose high and temperatures climbed toward the dangerous levels that characterized midday heat in the African savanna during the dry season. Rafiki was suffering badly from dehydration and shock in addition to the pain from his broken leg, and his breathing was becoming labored in ways that suggested his body was beginning to shut down from accumulated stress and trauma and the lack of food and water that young animals needed regularly to maintain their rapid metabolism. Amara used her body to create shade for the injured calf during the hottest hours when direct sun exposure could have killed him outright through heat stroke, positioning herself so that her bulk blocked the worst of the sun's rays and created a slightly cooler microclimate where Rafiki could rest without the additional stress of hyperthermia adding to his already overwhelming medical crisis. But creating shade for Rafiki meant exposing herself to the brutal midday sun that beat down on the savanna with intensity that could raise surface temperatures to levels that would burn exposed skin and cook unprotected flesh. Amara's dark tawny coat absorbed heat relentlessly, and within hours of taking up her shading position she was panting heavily with her tongue lolling and her body temperature rising toward dangerous levels that could cause organ damage or death if sustained for extended periods. The physiological stress of heat exposure combined with dehydration and exhaustion and hunger created compounding effects that degraded her physical condition much faster than any single stressor would have alone, pushing her body toward failure through the kind of accumulated damage that was difficult to recover from even with adequate rest and nutrition. The hyena clan, observing from their watching positions around the perimeter, recognized the signs of Amara's deteriorating condition and increased the frequency of their probing approaches during the second day, testing whether heat stress and dehydration had weakened her responses enough to create exploitable openings in her defense. They made 11 separate approach attempts throughout the day, each one requiring Amara to respond with aggressive charges that further depleted her dwindling energy reserves and exposed her to additional sun and heat stress during periods when she should have been seeking shade and rest to allow her body to recover from the brutal night she had just endured. Around mid-afternoon on the second day, Rafiki's condition reached a critical point that brought him very close to death from the combined effects of untreated injury, dehydration, shock, and heat exposure. His eyes rolled back in his head showing mostly whites. His breathing became so shallow that it was barely detectable even when Amara pressed her ear against his chest to listen for signs of continued life, and his body went completely limp in ways that suggested consciousness had fled and death was approaching rapidly. Amara responded to this crisis with behaviors that seemed almost human in their emotional quality and desperate urgency, nuzzling Rafiki's face and licking him vigorously and making soft vocalizations that sounded remarkably like the concerned whimpers that mammals across species produce when caring for young who are in distress or danger. She seemed to recognize that Rafiki needed water desperately if he was going to survive the next few hours, but the nearest water source was the small water hole located approximately 300 meters from their current position, and leaving Rafiki alone for the time it would take to reach the water and return would almost certainly result in the hyenas overwhelming him before she could get back to provide protection. Amara faced an impossible choice between maintaining her protective position and hoping Rafiki could survive without water for however many more hours or days this standoff continued, or abandoning him temporarily to attempt bringing water back in some way that her lion physiology was not equipped to accomplish since she had no means of carrying liquid over any significant distance. She left his side only once during the second day, making the decision that getting water for herself was essential if she was going to have any chance of continuing to provide protection through another night and potentially another day beyond that. The trip to the waterhole and back took approximately 10 minutes of rapid movement during which Amara drank desperately from the muddy water that was all that remained in the nearly dry waterhole at the end of the dry season, and then raced back toward Rafiki at her maximum sustainable speed because she could hear the hyenas beginning their rush toward the unprotected calf the moment she created enough distance that they judged an attack might succeed before she could return. She left his side only once during the second day, making a rapid trip to the waterhole to drink desperately needed water and then returning at a full run because she could hear the hyenas beginning to move toward Rafiki's position the moment she created distance between herself and the calf she was protecting. The second night was even more difficult than the first because Amara's energy reserves were now seriously depleted from 50 hours without food and from the constant stress of hypervigilance and repeated confrontations with the persistent hyena clan. She was beginning to experience the kind of physical and mental exhaustion that degraded reaction times and decision-making capacity and made even simple tasks feel overwhelming, but she maintained her protective position through sheer stubborn determination and whatever internal motivation was driving her to continue this irrational commitment to a creature that was not her species and that could offer her nothing in return for the enormous costs she was paying to keep him alive. The hyenas sensed her weakening condition and increased the frequency of their probing attacks throughout the second night, testing her responses and looking for the fatal hesitation or slowed reaction that would allow them to finally overwhelm her defense and claim the meal they had been pursuing for 2 full days now. Amara drove back attack after attack, drawing on reserves of strength and will that she did not know she possessed, fighting not just for Rafiki's survival but perhaps also for some deeper principle about not abandoning vulnerable creatures who had already been abandoned once and who deserved at least one protector who would not give up when things became difficult. On the morning of the third day, approximately 70 hours after Amara had first taken up her protective position, a Kenya Wildlife Service ranger vehicle appeared on the horizon driving cross-country in response to reports from tour groups who had observed the unusual standoff and reported it to park authorities as a potentially newsworthy wildlife event. The rangers, led by veteran wildlife officer James Kamau, who had worked in this reserve for 15 years and had seen countless unusual animal behaviors and interactions, initially approached cautiously because confronting a lioness who was displaying territorial and protective aggression was dangerous regardless of what that lioness was protecting or why she was behaving in ways that made no sense according to normal lion behavioral patterns. James had received the initial report about the unusual standoff from a tour guide who had been conducting a game drive with European tourists and had stumbled across the bizarre scene of a lioness apparently guarding an injured giraffe calf from a hyena clan, and his first reaction had been skepticism that what the guide was describing was being interpreted correctly. Lions did not protect giraffes, they hunted them. Any behavior that appeared protective was more likely to be a lioness claiming a kill and defending it from scavengers, or perhaps some misunderstanding about what was actually occurring in a complex multi-species interaction that non-experts might not properly interpret. But when James arrived at the location with his team and observed the situation through binoculars from their vehicle positioned at a respectful distance, he immediately recognized that something genuinely unprecedented was occurring that challenged his 15 years of accumulated knowledge about African predator behavior. The lioness was clearly emaciated and exhausted from days without food. Her ribs were showing through her coat in ways that indicated serious weight loss and caloric depletion, and she had visible injuries, including what appeared to be a fairly deep bite wound on her left foreleg that was attracting flies and showing signs of infection. Her body language communicated extreme stress and hypervigilance, her ears constantly moving to track sounds from all directions, her eyes scanning continuously even though she was swaying slightly from exhaustion in ways that suggested she was very close to collapse. But despite her obvious compromised physical condition, she maintained her protective position next to the injured giraffe calf and showed clear willingness to defend that position against any approach, including the ranger vehicle that represented a new and unpredictable threat. The giraffe calf was in even worse condition than the lioness, barely conscious and showing all the signs of severe dehydration and shock and untreated traumatic injury that would be fatal within hours if medical intervention did not occur very soon. His breathing was so shallow that James initially thought the calf might already be dead, and only careful observation with high magnification optics confirmed that the small body was still rising and falling with respirations that indicated life persisting against terrible odds. The compound fracture of the front leg was clearly visible even from the distance the rangers maintained, with bone protruding through skin in ways that would require immediate surgical intervention and long-term rehabilitation if there was any chance of saving the limb or the calf's life. James and his team observed the situation for approximately 20 minutes while he consulted via radio with wildlife veterinarians Dr. Helen Omondi at the rehabilitation facility and senior ranger coordinators at the park headquarters about how to proceed with what was clearly a complex and dangerous rescue operation that would require sedating an aggressive lioness while simultaneously preventing a hyena clan from claiming their intended prey during the window of opportunity that sedation would create. The consensus that emerged from these consultations was that they needed to move quickly because both animals were in critical condition and delays would reduce already marginal survival prospects. But they also needed to move carefully because mistakes could result in rangers being injured by the lioness or the calf being killed by hyenas if the timing and coordination of the intervention was not executed perfectly. Dr. Omondi provided detailed instructions about dosing calculations for the tranquilizer that would be used to sedate Amara, taking into account her estimated body weight and her compromised physical condition that might alter how she metabolized the drugs and how long she would remain unconscious. The dosing had to be precise because too little sedation would leave her partially conscious and potentially dangerous to approach, while too much could suppress her respiratory or cardiac function to the point of causing death from overdose, particularly given her already stressed physiological state. James loaded the tranquilizer dart carefully into the specialized rifle that rangers used for chemical immobilization of large animals, double-checking his calculations and equipment while his team prepared nets and noisemakers and vehicle positioning that would be necessary to control the hyena clan during the critical minutes when Amara would be unconscious and unable to provide protection to Rafiki. The decision to sedate Amara rather than attempting to somehow work around her conscious presence was not made lightly, because James recognized that the lioness had invested 3 days of her life in protecting this calf and that rendering her unconscious and removing the object of her protection might create psychological trauma or confusion that could affect her behavior after she recovered from sedation. But there was simply no safe way to provide medical care to Rafiki while an alert and protective lioness was present, and the calf's survival depended on rapid evacuation to facilities where emergency veterinary procedures could be performed by specialists with proper equipment and medications that were not available in field conditions. James and his team observed the situation from their vehicle for approximately 20 minutes, documenting the scene with photographs and notes and trying to understand what they were witnessing before deciding on any intervention strategy. They could see the injured giraffe calf lying in the grass with an obviously broken leg, could see the lioness positioned protectively next to the calf despite the fact that lions normally viewed young giraffes as prey rather than creatures requiring protection, could see the hyena clan maintaining their patient vigil at a distance waiting for any opportunity to claim what they clearly viewed as their rightful meal. The situation made no sense according to any framework James had for understanding predator behavior, and he consulted via radio with wildlife veterinarians and behavioral specialists to develop a plan for safely separating the lioness from the injured calf so that they could attempt medical treatment that might possibly save the young giraffe's life. The intervention required careful coordination and precise timing to avoid triggering an attack from the exhausted and stressed lioness who had invested 3 days in protecting this calf and who might interpret any approach as a threat requiring violent defensive response. The rangers used their vehicle to slowly approach the position where Amara and Rafiki were located, making no sudden movements and maintaining constant calm vocalizations through a loudspeaker system that communicated non-threatening intent as clearly as human technology allowed when dealing with wild predators who had no training in interpreting human communication. Amara watched their approach with obvious tension and wariness, her body language broadcasting that she was prepared to defend her charge against this new potential threat, but she did not immediately attack or retreat as the vehicle drew closer and eventually stopped approximately 10 meters from where she and Rafiki waited. James made the decision to attempt a tranquilizer dart that would sedate Amara long enough to allow them to evacuate the injured giraffe calf for medical treatment. Knowing that leaving Amara conscious and mobile during the evacuation would be impossibly dangerous for everyone involved and would likely result in someone getting severely injured or killed by a protective lioness defending what she clearly viewed as her responsibility. The dart was delivered precisely and professionally, and Amara's massive body began to show the effects of the sedation within 3 minutes, her movements becoming uncoordinated and her vigilance clearly degrading as the powerful drugs overwhelmed her nervous system and pulled her down into unconsciousness despite her obvious attempts to fight the effects and maintain her protective watch over Rafiki. As Amara collapsed into sedated sleep, the hyena clan immediately rushed forward, sensing that their opportunity had finally arrived after 3 days of patient waiting. But the rangers were prepared for this contingency and used noisemakers and vehicle positioning to drive the frustrated predators back while they worked quickly to load the injured giraffe calf into a specialized transport carrier that would protect him during the drive to the wildlife rehabilitation facility where emergency veterinary care waited. Rafiki was barely conscious from stress and dehydration and pain, and his survival prospects were assessed at less than 30% even with aggressive medical intervention. But he was alive against all odds specifically because a lioness had chosen to protect him rather than kill him or ignore him despite having no logical reason to make that choice. The rangers decided to leave Amara sedated in her current location rather than moving her, knowing that transporting a tranquilized lioness was dangerous and unnecessary since she would recover naturally from the sedation within a few hours and return to her normal ranging patterns. Before departing with Rafiki, James placed a GPS collar on Amara while she was unconscious so that researchers could track her movements and learn more about the lioness whose unprecedented behavior had saved a young giraffe's life and challenged everything the scientific community thought they understood about predator protective instincts and cross-species empathy. Rafiki survived his medical treatment and the subsequent long rehabilitation process, though he would never be able to return to the wild because his leg injury left him with permanent mobility limitations that made surviving in natural conditions impossible. He was eventually transferred to a protected sanctuary where he lived for another 12 years before dying of natural causes at an age that was quite respectable for a giraffe who had survived such catastrophic early trauma. Throughout his life in captivity, he showed unusual tolerance for lion vocalizations and seemed to show no fear response when exposed to lion scent, suggesting that his early experience with Amara had created some lasting impact on how his brain processed lions as either threats or potential protectors. The surgical repair of Rafiki's compound fracture required 3 separate procedures performed over the first 2 weeks after his rescue, each one addressing different aspects of the complex injury and the infections that had developed during the 3 days he spent lying in the grass with bone exposed to contamination from dirt and bacteria. Dr. Omondi and her veterinary team worked around the clock to save the leg, knowing that amputation would likely be fatal for a young giraffe who needed all 4 limbs functional to maintain the cardiovascular circulation that their unique physiology required. The surgeries were successful beyond what initial prognosis suggested was likely, with Rafiki eventually regaining enough function in the repaired leg that he could walk and even run short distances, though he would always have a pronounced limp and would never achieve the speeds or agility that wild giraffes needed to escape predators. Beyond the physical injuries, Rafiki showed significant psychological trauma from his abandonment and near-death experience that manifested in behaviors that concerned his caretakers during the early months of rehabilitation. He was hypervigilant and easily startled by sounds or movements that reminded him of predators. He struggled to bond with human caretakers or other giraffes in the sanctuary, and he showed signs of depression including reduced appetite and social withdrawal that suggested he was struggling to process what had happened to him. The The sanctuary staff worked patiently with him using techniques adapted from trauma therapy approaches developed for domestic animals, gradually helping him develop trust and security and the ability to form new attachments despite his early experiences of abandonment and terror. Interestingly, Rafiki showed particular comfort and reduced anxiety when sanctuary staff played recordings of lion vocalizations during his rehabilitation sessions, a response that was completely contrary to what would be expected from a giraffe who had been attacked by lions and abandoned to die. The staff theorized that his brain had imprinted on Amara's presence as a source of safety and protection during the 3 days when she was the only thing standing between him and certain death, creating an association between lion sounds and security that overrode the species' typical fear response that giraffes normally showed toward their primary predators. This unusual behavioral pattern persisted throughout Rafiki's life, and sanctuary visitors were often surprised to see him calmly resting near the fence line when lions in an adjacent enclosure were roaring, showing none of the alarm and flight responses that other giraffes in the sanctuary displayed in response to the same stimuli. Amara, tracked via her GPS collar, returned to her normal solitary hunting patterns and showed no obvious long-term effects from her 3-day protective vigil beyond the weight loss and temporary weakness that comes from sustained effort without adequate food or rest. But rangers who monitored her movements noted several interesting behavioral patterns that seemed potentially related to her experience protecting Rafiki. On 3 separate occasions over the following 2 years, Amara was observed showing unusual tolerance for young prey animals who were injured or separated from their groups, allowing them to remain in her vicinity without attacking them, and in at least one case actively defending a young impala from a hyena attack before eventually moving on and allowing the impala to escape rather than killing it herself. The most dramatic of these incidents occurred approximately 8 months after the Rafiki rescue, when rangers observed Amara discovering a young wildebeest calf that had been separated from its herd during a river crossing and was stranded on the wrong side of the water, unable to cross back due to strong currents and the presence of crocodiles. The calf was crying for its mother and showing obvious distress, and several predators including a pair of young male cheetahs were beginning to circle the vulnerable animal with clear hunting intent. Amara approached the scene from downwind, and rangers watching through binoculars expected to see her join the hunt and claim what should have been an easy meal requiring minimal effort or risk. Instead, Amara positioned herself between the wildebeest calf and the approaching cheetahs, displaying the same protective body language she had shown during the Rafiki incident, and she maintained that protective position for approximately 4 hours until the wildebeest herd returned to the area searching for their lost member and the calf was able to reunite with its mother and cross back to safety with the group. During those 4 hours, Amara drove off the 2 cheetahs twice, prevented a hyena from approaching, and showed no inclination to hunt the calf herself despite having not eaten for at least 2 days based on ranger monitoring of her movements and hunting success. When the calf finally rejoined its herd and moved away from the area, Amara simply watched them go and then returned to her normal ranging patterns as if nothing unusual had occurred, though rangers noted she appeared significantly more emaciated after this incident and had to hunt successfully twice over the following 3 days to recover the weight and energy she had sacrificed during her protective vigil. These incidents were too infrequent and ambiguous to draw definitive scientific conclusions about lasting behavioral changes resulting from her experience with Rafiki, but they suggested at minimum that Amara's protection of the giraffe calf was not an isolated anomaly but rather reflected something deeper about her individual personality or her capacity for responses that went beyond pure predatory programming. Wildlife behaviorists who studied her case debated whether her behavior represented genuine empathy and cross-species compassion or whether it could be explained through other frameworks involving hormonal states or misidentified parental instincts or simple opportunistic behavior related to claiming and defending a resource even if that resource was a living creature rather than a traditional food item. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the same researcher who had documented Tao's adoption of wild dog puppies, became involved in analyzing Amara's behavior and eventually published a paper comparing the 2 cases and identifying common factors that seemed to predispose certain individual predators toward cross-species protective behaviors that violated normal predatory patterns. Her analysis suggested that both Tao and Amara had experienced social isolation and loss of normal pride structures, that both had witnessed abandonment or loss that resonated with their own experiences, and that both had made split-second decisions to protect rather than kill during moments when vulnerable young animals triggered something deeper than hunger or territorial response. The paper's conclusion argued that these rare behaviors revealed important truths about the emotional complexity and cognitive flexibility of large predators that reductionist models of animal behavior failed to capture. Dr. Mitchell wrote, "When we observe a lioness protecting a giraffe calf for 3 days without food or rest, defending that calf against her own species' preferred prey patterns and investing enormous resources in the survival of a creature that offered her no benefit, we must acknowledge that something profound is occurring that our current frameworks cannot adequately explain. Whether we call it empathy or compassion or some other term, the underlying reality is that individual animals are capable of making choices that prioritize another creature's welfare over their own immediate interests, and those choices deserve recognition and serious study rather than dismissal as anomalies or errors in otherwise mechanistic behavioral systems. The story of Amara and Rafiki became known to the broader public through social media and wildlife documentaries, with millions of people worldwide viewing photographs and video footage of the lioness standing guard over the injured giraffe calf while hyenas circled in the background waiting for an opportunity to claim their intended prey. The images became iconic representations of unexpected compassion and cross-species protection, used in everything from conservation fundraising campaigns to philosophical discussions about the nature of morality and whether ethical behavior was unique to humans or represented something more universal that emerged from the basic mammalian capacity for empathy and suffering recognition. Years after both Amara and Rafiki had died, rangers still told their story to visitors who came to the Maasai Mara seeking to understand the natural world and the creatures who inhabited it. The story was used to illustrate that nature was far more complex than simple predator-prey dynamics suggested, that individual animals made choices that could not be reduced to genetic programming or survival optimization, and that the capacity for kindness existed even in creatures we had been taught to see as ruthless killers following rigid instincts without emotional depth or moral reasoning. If this story moved you, if it challenged your assumptions about the emotional lives of predators and made you consider the possibility that compassion and empathy are not uniquely human traits but universal responses to suffering that emerge across species when circumstances align in particular ways, we would be honored if you would share your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed an act of unexpected kindness from an animal toward another species? Have you ever been surprised by compassion emerging in a situation where logic and self-interest suggested it should not exist? Your stories and reflections matter because they contribute to a broader understanding of what is possible in nature and remind us that we share this planet with creatures whose capacity for care and protection goes far deeper than we have historically acknowledged. Please subscribe to Lion King Stories for more incredible true tales from the wild that prove the boundaries between species are more permeable than we thought, that empathy can override predatory instincts when individual experiences create the conditions for recognition and protection, and that every creature deserves to be seen as an individual capable of surprising us rather than a simple representative of species-level behavioral patterns. Thank you for being part of our pride and for opening your heart to stories that expand our understanding of what animals are truly capable of when circumstances give them the opportunity to choose compassion over predation.